we'll be uploading it for people that weren't able to attend. This is a webinar, which means that all attendees, you don't have audio or visual feed, but we very much want to hear from you tonight. So there's several ways that you can ask questions. We'll be answering questions throughout the presentation, and Jessica will be pausing at various spots. You can also raise your virtual hand. If you are calling in and you want to raise your hand, you'll have to push *9 and then *6 to unmute. You can also type in your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box. For property-specific questions, we ask that you type your information into the chat box, and we will follow up with you tomorrow and arrange an appointment to discuss your results that are specific to your property. You can also call our project contact line, and that number is 833-949-3673. And John Pramod is going to go ahead and type that into the chat box. Next slide, please, John. Okay, so we have about a 30-minute presentation followed by plenty of times for questions and answers. Jessica Law from the Water Board will be giving the presentation in its entirety tonight. And then we also have people here from Wood, which is Ford's technical consultant. And then also OEHA, which is the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. We have Amanda Palumbo, who's a toxicologist with OEHA. And I think that is just about everything I wanted to say. Once again, we're glad you're here, and I'm going to hand this over to Jessica. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming and joining with us tonight. So I'm going to cover the following items, just a brief project recap, then an overview of vapor intrusion and the screening levels we have used. Then I will give a summary of what has occurred since our last meeting. Next, I'll talk about the remediation process and what that entails. And then finally, I'll go over the next steps and project schedule before we go into that question and answer session. So before we get started,
Jessica, I just want to say we had one question in here, and I should have told people this. It's which residential communities are included on this call? Every residential community was invited to this meeting. This is a community-wide update. And the last thing I remembered I wanted to say is we really wanted to do this in person, but the COVID kept us all home yet again. But hope springs eternal. The next one, we hope to see all of you in person. Thanks.
Yeah. No problem. So before we get started, just want to mention that the things I'm going to talk about are technical. And while I do try to simplify it, I may not do a good enough job. So please feel free to let me know if you need something explained further by adding any questions you may have into chat. And I can answer them either during this presentation or at the end, and I can go back to any slide that you may want to revisit. So first, I just want to give a brief recap about the site and the how and why this vapor intrusion assessment began. Now, a lot of you probably have heard this before, so I will go over it kind of quickly. But if you do have any questions, again, just put them in the chat. So first, just to orient you, over here is Jamboree. Here's Bison Avenue, here's MacArthur. And the green line is the 200 acres that Ford had leased back during their operations, but they operated within this blue dashed line area here. And it was on approximately 98 acres. And the facility operated from 1957 until 1993 when it was closed. Cleanup activities occurred for about 3 years, and then in 1996, based on information provided by Ford, the Water Board determined that remediation of that main area was complete. And in 1997, the regulatory agency at the time, which was the Local Oversight Program, they granted soil closure, and this allowed the property to be rezoned from industrial use to residential use, and that redevelopment began in 1998. Which is now the One Ford Road community. And there was the requirement for the continued off-site groundwater assessment and remediation. And that's when the case was transferred to the Santa Ana Water Board for regulatory oversight. Now, since that time, the case has been open with us and all work has been conducted by Ford. under a voluntary agreement. And I just want to provide a little bit of clarification for those that may be newer to the area or newer to attending these meetings, and just talk about our role as the regulatory agency. So we oversee the assessment and cleanup activities at contaminated sites. Now, when a responsible party conducts work under Water Board oversight, whether it's voluntarily or under an order, the California Water Code authorizes the Water Board to recover costs associated with our oversight. And it's a different, it's the state agency that actually does the invoicing and collects payment. As the regulator, we don't. And just want to kind of put it out there that really it's of no concern of mine if we get paid or not. My job is the same regardless, and I get paid by the state regardless. So just want to let folks know, our mission is the protection of human health and the environment, regardless of the nature or position of a responsible party. So just to kind of continue on about the site history, in addition to that ongoing groundwater assessment, monitoring, and remediation, in 2006, 2008, and 2012, there were limited soil gas assessments that were conducted in select areas, which concluded health risks from vapor intrusion were not present. Now, these conclusions were made without any indoor air samples being collected, and it was based on industry knowledge of vapor intrusion at that time. So those conclusions were also made prior to the 2014 US EPA memo regarding short-term exposure risks from trichloroethene, or TCE, as well as the updated 2016 San Francisco Bay environmental screening levels, or ESLs, that we utilize. And then in 2017, a conceptual site model was prepared and submitted for the site. And a conceptual site model is a report that looks at the site history, all of the data collected, and compares it to the current screening levels and industry standards. And it identifies potential data gaps that may require additional investigation. And one of the data gaps that was identified in that report was the need to reevaluate the site for potential vapor intrusion due to groundwater concentrations and those previously mentioned historical soil gas assessments. And then in 2018, that's when the vapor intrusion assessment activities began. So now I just want to give a brief refresher of what vapor intrusion is. And this slide is probably familiar to most of you, but for anyone that's not attended one of these meetings, vapor intrusion is just simply the movement of vapors below the ground surface into a building, as shown by these red arrows. So first, in order for there to be a potential for vapor intrusion, there must first be contaminated soil gas, which is also referred to as soil vapor, which comes from contaminated soil and or groundwater. And soil gas is the gas that's found in the soil's air spaces, as shown by this inlay. So you have the soil particles, and then these little spaces is where those soil vapors can reside. So at this site, the primary contaminants of concern are tetrachloroethene, which is referred to as PCE, and trichloroethene, referred to as TCE. And both of these are vapor-forming chemicals. So these chemicals were commonly used as industrial solvents and metal degreasers, and were used during the site operations. So as the soil gas moves below the ground, it can enter buildings through either cracks in the foundation or utilities that enter the building. Now, normal ventilation can flush the chemicals out of a building so it doesn't cause a problem. But if they do collect in a building and there's not enough ventilation to flush it out, it can collect at concentrations that can pose a risk to human health. But there can also be other sources of chemicals, both in indoor and outdoor air. So if there's bad air pollution outside, it can come into a building. And if there's chemicals used, like cleaning products or dry clean clothes inside a building, they can introduce chemicals into indoor air as well. So now I just want to talk about the environmental screening levels, or ESLs, that we have been using to initially evaluate the site. So the ESLs were developed by research scientists at the San Francisco Bay Water Board, which is the same type of regulatory agency as the Santa Ana Water Board, but they cover the San Francisco area and are just kind enough to share those ESLs with the other water boards. So the ESLs were developed for over 100 chemicals that give us screening levels for soil, groundwater, soil gas, and indoor air contamination. And the way a screening level is calculated is by combining the following three elements. First, you have toxicity information of a specific chemical of concern. Then you have the specific exposure scenario for each receptor at the site. For example, skin contact, inhalation, digestion. And then there's the acceptable risk levels that the screening levels are to protect to. So acceptable risk levels look at both cancer and non-cancer health effects. So for the screening level, the acceptable cancer risk level is a 1 in a million chance of developing cancer. And this is referred to as cancer risk. And this is a standard that is developed by the US EPA. The other is no harmful non-cancer health effects, such as liver or kidney damage, and this is referred to as hazard. So both risk and hazard are calculated and are what are considered when we make risk management decisions. And I'm going to talk about what risk management decisions are a little later on in this presentation. So these three elements are combined to develop a screening level for a specific chemical. These ESLs address long-term exposure, and we're talking about 26 years. The ESLs allow us to quickly focus on the most significant problems at a contaminated site. And I want to make an important note about the ESLs. They're a starting point. Once we have site-specific data, that's what's evaluated in a risk assessment report. And the conclusions from the risk assessment reports help us to determine those next steps for the project to address known risks to human health and the environment, which I'll talk about a little later. And the ESLs are not necessarily cleanup goals, but they can be if there is direct exposure, such as an exceedance of an indoor air ESL. And I'm going to talk about what cleanup goals are for this project towards the end of the presentation and how ESLs and site-specific data are used to come up with those. So this slide just recaps what I said previously and is for your reference should you look at this presentation later. Okay, so now I want to talk about what has happened with the site since the last community meeting. And I want to note that there's just been a lot of work in general conducted to date for this site. And this is just for activities conducted from July 1st through December 31st, 2021. So first, regarding the vapor intrusion assessment, there were 19 soil gas probes installed at 10 locations, and these were installed to further evaluate the extent of the soil gas plume. 542 soil gas probes were sampled, 65 homes were sampled, 4 homes were offered air purifiers based on their indoor air sampling results, and then 36 homes were added to the indoor air investigation area. Reports are being submitted 2 times a year instead of the 4 times a year. And we have transitioned from assessment to monitoring for most of these areas, except for where we're doing a little bit of additional investigation, which is a really important milestone because now that means we can start looking at those next steps in regards to cleanup activities. And I'll talk more on what that's going to look like. Then there's the data gap assessment activities. So that's just some additional investigation to look at, do some additional groundwater assessment, as well as evaluating soil gas deeper than the 15 feet below ground surface that the vapor intrusion assessment has looked at. So there has been 42 groundwater grab samples collected from 7 locations, and at each location, multiple groundwater samples were collected from multiple discrete depths below the ground. And then an area within the indoor air investigation area was identified to just be further evaluated to determine the source of that soil vapor plume. And that work is going to be occurring this year, and I'll show those locations now. So this figure,
Jessica, I
yes.
just want to interrupt you because you have one question, and that is, what is the ATC area?
Oh, yeah. That is down here. That's the aerothermal chemical building area, and it was about 8 acres in size. And that's where they did some rocket manufacturing, rocket motor manufacturing and research and development during that time. And so that was just kind of a little bit of a separate unit from the other activities that occurred.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so here's the 3 areas where some additional activities have been occurring. Up here at the northern area of the, or north of the former facility, is Newport North apartment complex and Corsica Villas, as well as some commercial properties to the west. And it's the Newport North property where we had to bring in a few additional homes into the indoor air investigation. And then the other area is down here south of the former facility within Belcourt Hill and Sea Island communities. And for those 2 communities, the initial assessment, groundwater assessment, is pretty much wrapped up. And so we're going to be asking Ford here in the near future to install a few groundwater monitoring wells below the ground to monitor the groundwater plume in that area. And I just want to make an important note that the I'm referring to shallow groundwater to be monitored, not drinking water. Your drinking water is safe to drink, it's not impacted, and it does meet all state and federal requirements. And then the area here in the central part, that's the area that we just brought in as part of the conclusion of the risk assessment report. We determined that we needed a little bit more information to determine the next steps for that specific area. And I'll talk more on the kind of why for that in the coming slides. So then a big milestone that's occurred since our last meeting is now we have responded to all 9 of the human health risk assessment reports, and the next steps were included in our responses. So by June 30th last year, we had received all 9 of the requested risk assessment reports. 8 of them were for residential communities, and 1 was for the 3 commercial properties that were evaluated. OEHA did assist the Water Board with the reviews of those reports. And just a reminder, OEHA is our sister agency who is the lead state agency for the assessment of health risks posed by environmental contaminants. Therefore, for this case, we have Amanda from OEHA. She's a toxicologist to assist with addressing any health risk concerns and to assist with the review of those risk assessments. And then, as I mentioned, the Water Board has responded to all 9 of the reports. And we have also conducted all of the community specific meetings to discuss the results and conclusions and next steps of those risk assessments. And the recordings for those meetings are available on GeoTracker or Ford site specific website. And I know John has been putting some links in chat for you guys. And if you could make sure both are in there, John, I would appreciate that. So then the general next steps for the from the risk assessments all included the need to conduct some long-term indoor air monitoring to confirm the results of the risk assessments that they remain protective of human health. So the monitoring frequency will be dependent on those future risk calculations, as well as how that soil gas plume is doing. How stable is it? Are we seeing decreasing concentrations, or are the concentrations staying the same, or are they increasing? And so this next step is just one of the steps that has taken us from assessing vapor intrusion to now monitoring it. And we want to confirm that things are staying the same when no vapor intrusion was identified, or getting better if vapor intrusion was identified. But we also want to provide data so that we can act if we see vapor intrusion occurring where it was previously not observed. And I will say, from the majority of the soil gas data that has been collected to date, I don't anticipate seen vapor intrusion starting to occur where it previously wasn't, but we want indoor air samples collected to support that. The other item is preparing either a feasibility study report or a feasibility study and remedial action plan. And that is just based on the results and the review of each risk assessment report. And I'll talk about the differences of those two reports in a few slides. And then to conduct some additional assessment activities where additional information was needed to determine those next steps. So once we have all the data collected from the site, and the risk assessments have been prepared, we're able to make risk management decisions. And risk management for this site is just the process that evaluates options for protecting public health from vapor intrusion threats. So our risk management decisions are based on the calculated current and future risk. And the current risk calculates that cancer risk and hazard based on existing indoor air concentrations, and future risk is calculates that cancer risk and hazard based on the soil gas concentrations, and it models risk based on the most protective assumptions as well as site-specific assumptions. And it's critical to understand both current and future risk when making risk management decisions. And most importantly, our risk management decisions must be protective of human health. So our risk management decisions are the path forward from that human health risk assessment reports that were prepared and reviewed. Now, of the 9 risk assessments, there are 3 primary paths forward in addition to that long-term indoor air monitoring. So for some communities, we've requested additional assessment. And this is because we need a little bit more information to determine the next steps. Now, for these areas, the risk is generally low and we're not really seeing any vapor intrusion occurring. And these areas are will likely not need any kind of remediation or mitigation, but we do need some additional data points to confirm. Next is a feasibility study, which is a report that evaluates the feasibility of implementing a cleanup technology. And this report also recommends a remedial alternative. And a remedial alternative is just one or more remedial technologies to achieve cleanup goals. And we request this report when current risk is generally low, or maybe we're seeing just slight vapor intrusion occurring, but the future risk is higher, and we want to determine if remediation is feasible or not. And if remediation is feasible, then we will ask for a remedial action plan to move forward with cleanup. And then finally is the feasibility study and remedial action plan. And this includes everything from the feasibility study, but it also describes the recommended remedial alternative. And we requested this report when vapor intrusion was identified and future risk was also higher. So some type of either remediation and or long-term mitigation is necessary. And that kind of leads us into the remediation process. So I had gone over this slide at the last community meeting, but I still want to go over it again because these are the items, these really are just the majority of the next steps that are going to be occurring for this project now. So we've had all the site investigation because before we can get into cleanup, we need to know the extent of contamination. So that has been all that field investigation that's been conducted. And that has been that soil gas and groundwater and indoor air sampling that's occurred over the last couple of years. And that data that was collected is what was needed to do that risk evaluation, which was presented in those human health risk assessment reports. So while we are mostly done with the site investigation, there is still a little bit occurring. And as new data comes available, those risk assessments can get updated. But those risk evaluations do determine if a site requires cleanup, additional monitoring, more assessment, or if no additional activities are necessary at that time. So the next is a feasibility study and remedial action plan. And this is also called an FSRAP. So for communities where cleanup activities are necessary, this is the next step. And this process can take approximately 6 months. The FSRAP develops and evaluates those remedial alternatives for for consideration based on selected criteria. And then it recommends that one remedial alternative. And this report, as well as a feasibility study, are submitted in draft form to allow for public comment prior to finalizing. So as the regulatory agency, we can accept the recommendations from the FSRAP or FS as is, or we can, have comments with it, or we can reject it entirely. Now, once we provide our comments on the draft feasibility study and remedial action plan, then comes that public comment period. And the public comment period is 30 days. And this is when the proposed remedy is announced. And it allows for the public to an opportunity just for public input. The water board sends out a fact sheet on the report, and we also host a meeting with the community that feasibility study or the FSRAP applies to, so that we can discuss the report and recommendations and answer any questions. And public comments are incorporated into the final document as feasible. And once that document's been finalized, next is remedial design. So this step can all take about 6 months to a year, and it includes the remedial design and implementation plan that is submitted to the water board for approval, as well as securing all of the necessary permits. And I do want to mention that Ford will be working with the individual communities where active remediation is necessary for the development of those remedial designs. And then we get into remedy implementation, and this just includes the safe implementation of the remedy, as well as the operation and maintenance of the remedy, which includes regular monitoring. And it's important to note that the duration of these steps may change due to weather, permitting, and other factors. And then the final step, once remediation is complete, is post-remediation monitoring. Now, during this phase, we evaluate post-remediation concentrations to determine what those concentrations are doing. Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? Are they remaining the same? Because this information lets us know if that remediation system needs to get turned back on or not. And that monitoring is one of the lines of evidence that is used to support a request for case closure when that time comes.
Jessica, we have a question in the chat. It says, why was residential housing approved before proper cleanup of the site?
So at the time, it met all the proper cleanup activities. It met all of the remedial action objectives for that time and those standards. And then something that has just changed over time has been an general industry standard knowledge increase on vapor intrusion. And so that's something that was not, I think, considered as much, and they still looked at it, but what they knew back then has changed to now. And if they would like any more clarification on that,
please just put it in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we will add any clarification on that. Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah. Okay, so now I just want to talk about the remedial action objectives, which are the cleanup goals for soil, soil gas, groundwater, and indoor air. So we started off the investigation using those ESLs to screen the site. From there, we've collected a lot of site data, and now we're able to use that site data and risk assessment results to help establish cleanup goals to get the site to closure. And the cleanup goals need to be protective of human health and the environment. So for direct exposure, such as shallow soil or indoor air, the cleanup goals we tend to use are the ESLs because the risk is already calculated using protective scenarios and exposure is possible. When there isn't a direct exposure potential, such as groundwater, and I'm not talking about drinking water, but that shallow groundwater or deep soil that you wouldn't come in contact with, like, during, say, construction activities, and then soil gas, site-specific screening levels can be utilized, as well as looking at the trends of the concentrations to support the cleanup goals. And achieving these goals with the supporting analytical data over time is what will get the site to closure. So now we can talk about kind of the timeline for the remediation path forward for the 3 communities that have these feasibility study and remedial action plans submitted for them. So there's a lot of components in the remediation process, as I had outlined just a couple slides ago, and you can see that on this timeline. So first, for Bay Ridge Park, we started off with that draft feasibility study and remedial action plan, or FSRAP, and we commented on that. We had public comment period and conducted a community meeting with Bay Ridge Park to talk about the FSRAP. Then once that document was finalized, we requested and received that remedial design and implementation plan, which is referred to as an RDIP, and that document is really just the guts of the cleanup plan. So now we're kind of current time, first quarter this year, which is that January through March time period and forward. So we have approved the RDIP, and now comes all of the work to get this implemented, which will take about 6 months. And this includes permitting, getting the equipment, planning, doing a subslab depressurization pilot test, and installing the wells and piping. And Ford is going to be sending out notices of work, and they will be working with Bay Ridge Park regarding communication expectations during the construction portion. And then finally, we anticipate the startup of the soil vapor extraction system in July of this year. And of course, these durations may change due to weather, permitting, and other factors. So next is Belcourt Terrace, and the path forward is the same as I mentioned for Bay Ridge Park, but their schedule is about 3 months behind Bay Ridge. And all of the activities are the same. So Ford is going to be sending out those notices of work for construction activities and working with Belcourt Terrace and Belcourt Master regarding communication expectations. And we anticipate the startup of the soil vapor extraction system in November of this year. And again, there's that little caveat of, these durations can change due to those factors listed. Then we have the One Ford Road community, and the reporting, public comment period, and community meetings are all the same here as they were for the other 2 communities and are outlined on this slide. But their remediation path forward looks a little different here, because as a reminder, there was about 3 years worth of remediation activities that occurred in the mid-1990s prior to the development of One Ford Road, which is likely why there isn't a specific area where we're seeing these higher soil gas concentrations and vapor intrusion. It's sporadic. Therefore, the remediation path forward is looking at specific areas, and it's going to implement monitoring throughout and then evaluate select areas to either conduct limited soil vapor extraction, install subslab depressurization systems. But these next steps are still being considered because we need to discuss this in more detail with the community and have their public comment period, which is coming up. So I also want to talk about the what's going to be happening longer term. And it's important to note that these activities can all go in parallel. So first is monitoring, which is going to be ongoing until case closure. And that includes monitoring both groundwater and soil gas to evaluate that plume stability. That's a really important thing. We want to see that the plume is not just moving locations. We want to see that it's decreasing. We want to see concentrations decreasing. And both are sampled 2 times a year. And then there's going to be that long-term indoor air monitoring. And that monitoring frequency is going to range from every 6 months to once every 5 years. And it's dependent on those future risk calculations from the human health risk assessments. Then there's the risk assessments. So while the initial reports have already been submitted and responded to, they are going to be updated as more data becomes available. And the need for updates is going to be evaluated every 6 months and documented in the semi-annual monitoring reports. And these updates are just going to confirm that those risk calculations remain protective. And if they aren't, then we can act on it in a timely fashion. And then finally is remediation, which includes that remedial design and remedy implementation schedule that I just covered. And then there's the post-remediation monitoring, which will occur for probably about 2 years, but it can be longer, and that happens after the remediation systems are turned off. So to summarize, the data gap assessment activities are going to continue until groundwater and soil gas contaminant plumes have been adequately delineated. We're going to continue our efforts to gain access and test indoor air. Review those feasibility studies and then hold community specific meetings on those reports, and then begin the remediation activities in select areas following that remediation process I outlined earlier. So for additional information, you can go to GeoTracker, which is the state's database, and there is a specific spot for all of the reports and analytical data for this particular project. You can sign up for LIRIS list, which is the state's email notification subscription. And that's how we can let you know of next public events, public meetings. And a question that I do have for folks is if you can raise your hand and use the raise hand feature for the next public meeting. We've, for the last couple of years have been doing these presentations and giving these general updates, and would like some feedback if you would prefer, once we can go in person, to do more of an open house where we just have information booths and no formal presentation, and just have an opportunity to more talk about what your specific areas of interest are. If it's the risk assessments or the remediation, whatever it may be, we'd be there to do more face-to-face conversations versus a presentation. So do the
Or
raise.
I think in the past we've done a hybrid too. We've done a short presentation followed by an open house where we have poster boards and you can go and look at your specific area of interest.
Yeah.
And talk with the technical team. So I'm just going to say, I don't think we were clear. If you would like to have us do in person with the open house, if you would raise your virtual hand, that would be fantastic. And we'll just take a poll and we'll let you know the number, and we'll do that when we are cleared from the COVID.
Yeah, because that would just help, because it lets us know how to best communicate with you guys. Also, the Water Board has a web page specific for this project. Ford has their site-specific website and 800 number, and then there is the local information repository at the local library. So that concludes my presentation, and we do have all of our subject matter experts here to answer any questions you may have. So I will turn it back to you, Tracy.
Okay, so this is question and answer time. There's a quick question in here. I must prefer this. You prefer the virtual format. Okay, well, that's one person and 3 people. I think they like the in-house idea, so we'll have to think about that. No conclusive ideas. So if you have a question, please raise your virtual hand and I will unmute you, and we're happy to hear what you have to say. I'm going to start with, I think, E. Sanchez. I think you would like to speak. I'm not sure if you're raising your hand to tell us you want to do this in person or, oh, I think you are. So, okay, back we go. So Bruce and Nadine, I am unmuting you, and please feel free to talk. We're very glad you're here. I think you're going to need to unmute yourself. John, do you want to help them out there if you can?
It looks like you've unmuted Bruce and Nadine. Would you mind talking?
There we go.
Thank you, but we didn't have a question.
Oh, okay. No worries.
Well, we're glad you talked anyway. We'll lower your hand for you too.
Thanks.
Why did you push the raise the hand button?
I know.
What about other people? Any other people have questions or want more information or just want to say hello? We'll give you a couple minutes. Oh, okay. Hi, Perry Kupperman. And there you go. Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
All right. I guess the question I have is what progress, what new information, what new conclusions have been reached in the last 30 to 60 days?
I'll answer that. We don't, there hasn't been any new conclusions in the last 60 days, 30 to 60 days, that I can think of off the top of my head. I know I've responded to a lot of reports, and we've generally covered all those risk assessments here recently. In general, you know, the project's moving forward, and we're transitioning to that cleanup, and that's, I think, really the big takeaway of what's occurring right now.
All right. Thank you.
I don't know, Mike, do you have something to add? Any other additional like big things you want to highlight?
I would say it's not so much what conclusions we've come up with. Oh, hold on. Sorry, I'm having. How's that? On. All right, can everybody hear me now?
Much better.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was having computer issues and I had to call in from my phone, and then my computer decided to cooperate at the same time right when Perry asked his question. So Perry, I think it's more of a matter of not necessarily what conclusions we've reached in the last 60 days, but where we've moved forward with the next steps as far as remedial action, specific to Bay Ridge Park and Belcourt Terrace. Things are moving along pretty quickly with that. So again, you know, with some of the data gap investigation activities, we're seeing some new information and new data come up, but that's in isolated areas. And so again, I think it's more a matter of where we are with our remedial action, and those next steps towards cleanup is really where we're at in the project, and more moving into a monitoring phase. I mean, there is some, you know, characterization and assessment that's going to be ongoing, but it's in a much smaller scale than it was before. So really, we're kind of crossing that bridge into remedial alternatives and cleanup in particular areas.
Okay, other questions? We'll give it a minute.
Tracy, we have a question in the Q&A.
Thank you. Is there a construction implementation schedule for Bay Ridge, master schedule of construction? Jessica, is that you or is that mine?
That would the construction details. I'm going to leave that for maybe Daniela wants to talk on that.
Yeah, sure. So we're working on that schedule, and that will be shared with the community once it's available. We're kind of close, but not yet ready to kind of finalize that type of construction schedule. One of the things we'll be very cognizant of is being very communicative with Bay Ridge Park when we're doing work, you know, notifying them through mailers, speaking, you know, calling, you know, specific homes if they're going to be, you know, if work's going to be conducted right in front of their front door, just to make sure that the communication lines are really clear. It'll be pretty parcel specific, so I don't think the notice of work going to go out past Bay Ridge Park, kind of that community wall. But same thing we'll do once we have a schedule for Belcourt Terrace. We'll be sending out notice of work every time we are doing some construction mobilization work, and we'll kind of keep the community informed of a big picture schedule of the construction timeline.
Okay, thank you. And then there's another question. There was mention of installation of vapor extraction wells. Where and what is installed?
Daniela, I'm gonna let you go ahead
Yeah, go ahead, Daniela, run with that.
and just give
Sure.
those
So,
details.
so right now we have proposed and gotten approved by the water board installation of 13 soil vapor extraction wells within Bay Ridge Park. It's in the eastern side of the community. Most of the wells are kind of along Hartford Drive, which is kind of that perimeter road. Some of the wells are going to be kind of on Seaborough or some of those other internal streets. A soil vapor extraction well from, you know, the street is not very much to look at. It's all underground. So what it is, you can kind of picture this tube goes into the ground, and underground it has it's perforated. So we are able to attach it to our soil vapor extraction treatment system, which will be, the system will be above ground through a series.
Hey, Mike, I think you need to mute your phone. We're getting lots of feedback from you.
Me?
No,
Oh,
Mike Barnes. Keep going, Daniela.
Oh, so the underground piping will connect to the extraction well, and we'll be able to pull vapors, kind of like a vacuum cleaner, pulling out from the subsurface. What will it look like at the surface? It's going to look like a tiny kind of manhole cover, you know, little metal, either circle or square cover, that you'll be able to drive over. It'll be flush with the asphalt. So visually, once it's installed, it's not going to look like much because all of the action is happening below ground.
Okay, great. Other questions? Again, you can type them in the Q&A box, type them in the chat box, or you can raise your hand in here. Can you go over the status again for the Newport North apartment area site?
So Mike, I'll let you, as long as you're on,
Yeah,
go on just like the next steps, and you know, the areas that we've had to add the indoor air investigation and just that kind of general
Sure,
info.
no problem. So as Jessica mentioned, we've conducted a human health risk assessment for the section of Newport North apartment homes that have had indoor air testing to date. And that's kind of towards the southern portion of Newport North homes, just north of the community or the shopping center area there. For the purpose of the feasibility study, we'll be looking at that one particular area, because in order to conduct the feasibility study, we have to have an HHRA produced. However, during some of our data gap investigation activities, we've identified some soil gas concentrations that are prompting additional indoor air sampling to the north. And so what we're going to do is kind of take a phased approach or divide the Newport North apartment homes complex into two different investigation areas or two different areas of interest. So right now, since the northern portion is fairly new, in order to conduct or submit an addendum to an HHRA, we have to conduct indoor air sampling. In order to evaluate effectively a building, you have to have 2 seasonal sampling events 6 months apart. So the HHRA addendum to that northern area of interest will be the next step and will probably occur in the next year. So that's where we're at with Newport North specifically. The FS, Daniela, do you want to talk about that? When is the due date for the FS for parcel 1 for that southern area of interest?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. There you go. That's right. So that'll be submitted tomorrow to the water board.
And it'll be a few months before I review that. And I want to add, while we're at that stage with these risk assessment reports and the feasibility studies, we have separated them out into community specific reports, because things like just having their own separate HOA or property management group, and building types and things like that makes it separate and unique. But we do look at, you know, the water board is looking at all of the data as a whole as well. So while it seems like we're kind of compartmentalizing everything, it all kind of blends together as well on our end when it comes to reviews. So I just wanted to add that clarification.
Thanks, Jessica.
Okay, we have another question here. Is there any estimate of when construction will begin? Weeks, months, quarter? What kind of notice do you anticipate giving us? Weeks or months? I don't know what area
can-
it's for.
I
So
can take that, Tracy. I think that
Okay.
was a follow-on to the Bay Ridge Park question. And so, yeah, so we're actually hoping to start with some initial installation of groundwater monitoring wells in February. And we will give at least 1 week mailer written notice mailed out to the community. Where we can give greater notice, we will, but you know, we'll get at least a week to let people know about that.
Daniela, you accidentally muted yourself, I think.
I did accidentally mute myself. Sorry about that. So you heard we'll be giving you a week, at minimum a week notice through a mailer. We'll give you more where we can. The other components of the construction are probably going to start in the second quarter. And it'll take, you know, 1 to 2 quarters to complete construction. We don't anticipate construction, you know, every single day, but just in terms of that total duration, with the goal of turning on the soil vapor extraction system in Q3 of this year. Of course, that's pending some permitting and some supply chain kind of restrictions, or should I say just kind of delays. Like everything else, supply chain will impact our project as well, but we're trying to stay ahead of that as much as we can.
And can I just give a little bit of clarification when we're saying, when Daniela is talking about quarters, so first quarter is that January through March, and the start of second quarter is April through June, and then third quarter is July through September, and then fourth quarter is October through December. And as far as our response letter for construction activities to get things started, we requested a date of no later than, I think it was February 25th, just so that way you guys can, the community can have a kind of general idea of around February 25th is when activities will likely start occurring.
And if I can just add to that, the activities that Daniela referenced with regards to the installation of the groundwater monitoring wells, those activities are what we would consider probably the less intrusive activities. And therefore we'll have the notice of work that'll go out, it'll describe the work, it'll give a schedule. We also will be reaching out to individual property owners where we'll be set up right outside of their garage or their unit to communicate effectively with them, to let them know when the drill rig essentially will be parked outside of their property. So if it's blocking their garage, we can work with them to get their cars out or whatever it may be, or to move the drill rig so they can come in and out. When we get to the actual installation of the soil vapor extraction system, that's the larger effort. And we will not only send out a notice of work with detailed description of that work and a schedule, we plan on holding a poolside chat again, as we did with the presentation for the remedial design implementation plan, to kind of go through everything and answer any questions people may have through the process. And we'll do that well in advance of breaking ground for that larger portion of the project, which is actually the installation of the extraction system.
Okay, other questions? Okay, is there a construction implementation schedule for, did I already read this one,
You
John?
did, yeah.
I thought so. I was like, oh, Groundhog Day, forgive me. Let me just say that one's done. There we go.
And
Other questions?
I should also add, Tracy, that you can expect what you'll see in Bay Ridge Park is very similar to what you're going to see in Belcourt Terrace, just a smaller scale.
Oh, thank you. I think that's helpful. And I would add for anybody that if you have ideas how we can improve our communications to make sure you know what's going on, we're all ears. So you can type that in the chat box or give us a call too. Okay, I don't think there's any more questions. I'm just going to wait a minute, and if anybody has any questions, they can go ahead. And again, John, can you just throw up the screen with all of the information on it? Do we have that? The one previous?
Jessica, can you
Oh, it's
move
Jessica.
the
Sorry,
slide
I
back
forgot
to
your
the
name.
one
Slide deck.
previous?
There we are. There you are. And remember, John put the geo tracker and the phone number in the chat box. So I don't think we actually have any more questions, and I'm sure everybody would appreciate getting a half hour back for their evening. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Remind you that we're always available to answer questions. Thank you for your patience as we move through with this project. And I'd like to just hand it off to Jessica one more time for her to say good night as well.
Thank you, everyone. And again, if you have questions that come up afterwards, feel free to reach out to any of us. And thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, wishing everybody a nice evening.
Night.
Good night.